March 1980. Torrential rain hammers down on the Ecuadorian city of Ambato, deep in the Andes mountain range. The rain is so intense that rivers overflow, mudslides carve through neighborhoods, and whole streets vanish beneath a tide of brown water. Rescue crews move slowly through the devastation, wading through debris and hauling out fragments of collapsed homes as they search for survivors. Families watch helplessly from the hillsides, waiting for news of loved ones swept away in the floods. But then, amid the tragedy and chaos, something unexpected is found. On the banks of a swollen river, searchers uncover the remains of a young girl. At first, they assume she drowned in the flood, like so many others. But her body tells a different story. She had been brutally strangled, with such extreme violence that her eyes had bulged from their sockets. Then another young girl's body is found. And then a third, and a fourth. 4 young girls, who'd all been assaulted, strangled and murdered in the exact same manner, unearthed from their shallow graves by the storm. For the locals, this horrific discovery confirms what they had long suspected. Because for the last few months, dozens and dozens of young girls between the ages of 8 and 12 had been disappearing across the mountainous regions of Ecuador. Parents and locals had pleaded for the police to investigate what was going on, but had always been dismissed, told that their children had likely just run away. Any reports the police did take seriously, they concluded were the work of the human trafficking and sex exploitation networks that were plaguing the country and its neighbours at the time. But the residents were convinced something else was going on. Parents searched desperately. Posters were plastered on walls, rewards offered, ads placed in newspapers, but none of the missing children were ever found. Until now. So with the discovery of the 4 murdered girls in Ambato, it seems clear to everyone that something much darker than the police had claimed is happening. A serial predator is hunting children across the nation. And within days, he strikes again. Except this time, things don't go the way he'd planned. On March 9th, a man selling trinkets at Ambato's busy market in Plaza Urbina approaches 11-year-old Marie and attempts to convince her to leave with him. But when her mother, Carlina Ramon Poveda, sees him holding her daughter's hand and realizes what's happening, she raises the alarm, screaming out for help. The man attempts to flee, but several vendors chase him down and tackle him to the ground, holding him until the police can come and arrest him. And that man's name is Pedro Alonso Lopez. When officers finally arrive at the scene, Pedro is babbling incoherently. So initially, he doesn't seem like a likely candidate for the prolific and organized predator they had just learned existed. He just seems like a deranged madman. But he isn't. In reality, Pedro is one of the most prolific serial killers in history, and it wouldn't be long before he'd lead the investigators to the graves of 53 more girls he'd murdered, with a confirmed victim total of 110 in Ecuador. Except, he didn't just commit his crimes in Ecuador. Murdering across 3 countries, Ecuador, Colombia and Peru, authorities believe him to have murdered more than 300 girls before his 1980 arrest. With claims that he murdered 2 or 3 girls every single week at his peak, he was even listed in the Guinness World Records as the most prolific serial killer in history, until they removed the category for what I think should be very obvious reasons. As Pedro put it himself, "I am the man of the century. No one will ever forget me." And while most serial killer stories end the same way, an arrest, a trial, the discovery of victims, speculation over motive and other possible victims, Pedro's case is different. Because shockingly, despite the evidence against him and his own confessions, he would only serve 14 years in prison. And by 1998, he walked out of a psychiatric facility and disappeared. And to this day, nobody even knows where he is. Nobody knows whether he's alive or dead. Nobody knows if he's still out there and if he's still killing. This is the story of Pedro Lopez, the monster of the Andes. Before we get back into the story, I just want to remind you to please like and subscribe if you find the video interesting, and feel free to comment down below with any thoughts, as all that sort of engagement really helps the video out. This case is potentially the most requested I've ever had on the channel, coming up regularly in the comment sections of my videos, and I totally get why. And to be honest, it's really surprising this one doesn't have more coverage. Interestingly, while it is a well-known case compared to some of the others I've recently covered, it's actually been quite a difficult one to research. There's a lot of info out there on it, in English, as well as various other languages. But so much of that information is contradictory or different across accounts. I assume this comes down to when and where the case happened, leading to various mistranslations across the decades that have been repeated and gotten muddled with the truth. Just as an example, in my intro, I state the flooding occurred in 1980, but many sources claim it happened in 1979. And while they all agree it happened before Pedro was identified and arrested, many claim the floods occurred in April 1980. The arrest almost definitely happened on March 9th based on contemporary newspaper reports, so the timeline of it all gets very confusing very quickly. As another example, the mother of the last attempted victim is called Carlina Ramon, or Carvina Poveda in many sources, seeming to differ depending on the language of the source. The real name looks to be Carlina Ramon Poveda, a combination of them both. Many English language accounts seem to claim Carlina was a vendor at the market and that Pedro just spoke to her daughter, whereas many Spanish language accounts claim that Carlina was shopping at the market when Pedro grabbed her daughter and tried to flee with her, resulting in a violent confrontation with other merchants who stopped him. Anyway, I just thought it was worth trying to highlight to you that while the overall story is the same, many of the small details are different, even when it comes to contemporary reports and very legitimate deep dives into the case. So I've tried my best to find the truth among all the contradictions, but I'm sure I'll have gotten some of the smaller details incorrect in my account. So with all that said, let's jump straight back into the story. And in this instance, we're going to start right at the beginning. So since I've been low-key pushing it as a catchphrase, even if it doesn't quite apply right now, I'm going to say it. It's time to go all the way back to the start. Pedro Alonso Lopez entered the world on October 8, 1948 in the Colombian town of Venadillo, which is part of the Tolima region. He was the seventh of 13 children, in a family already drowning in hardship. His father, Megdado Reyes, was killed 6 months before he was born in La Violencia, a brutal civil war that had erupted between liberal and conservative factions in Colombia. It was a time of mass killings, burned villages, and rivers that carried bodies downstream. Hundreds of thousands, mostly civilians, were killed, and even more were left displaced and lost. Human rights abuses carried out by guerrilla groups, paramilitaries, and even the military themselves were a daily reality. Crime rates soared to levels unmatched anywhere else in the world. Pedro was born into one of the main epicenters of the conflict, and his life was engulfed in death, violence, and bloodshed from the very beginning. His mother, Benilda Lopez de Castañeda, struggled to provide for her many children and was forced to turn to sex work to feed them. But the family lived in a one-room shack, separated only by a thin curtain. So every night, on one side of the curtain, Benilda engaged in loud sexual activities with her clients. On the other side, her children attempted to sleep, hearing everything. Instead of warmth, it was a home filled with confusion and trauma. Neighbours would later remember Benilda as a woman with a harsh temper. Some said she beat her children with a broom handle, often singling out Pedro, with claims that she hit him constantly. Discipline in the house was not a raised voice or a warning, it was violence. Surrounded by sex and brutality, Pedro never learned tenderness or affection. Instead, his earliest lessons were that pain was routine and that intimacy was corrupted. By the age of 9, things reached a breaking point. One day, Pedro was caught trying to inappropriately touch one of his younger sisters, and his mother's reaction was swift and merciless. She heated a candle and pressed it against his bare feet, burning his flesh. Then, without hesitation, she kicked the young child out of her house and banished him. From that moment on, he lived as a child on the streets. In the 1950s and 60s, Colombia's capital city, Bogotá, was a place where thousands of abandoned children roamed aimlessly. They slept under bridges, huddled in alleyways, and scavenged for scraps in trash heaps. Pedro made his way there and became one of these children, just another face among the lost. He scoured garbage bins for scraps of food, slept wherever he could, and learned to fight with knives to protect himself. At one point, an older man offered him food and shelter. Desperate and hungry, Pedro went with him. But instead of kindness, he was led to an abandoned building, where he was repeatedly assaulted before being cast back out into the night. Unfortunately, this was not an isolated incident, and he was attacked and abused many more times. And he wasn't the only one. There were many people who took advantage of all the vulnerable children living on the streets. Some lured and abused them, like with Pedro. Others abducted them and forced them to become sex workers. With each traumatic event that he experienced, Pedro grew colder and more detached. To numb himself, he smoked bazuco, a crude paste made from coca leaves, which was one of the cheapest and most destructive drugs in the city. The substance was highly addictive and caused mood swings and paranoia, and he quickly became dependent on it. Many of the street children formed gangs for protection. These gangs of street children were often described as feral, and Pedro fit right in. He fought with them for turf, robbed houses, and got into fights, living on the margins of society. What little innocence he had left disappeared on those streets. At the age of 10, it briefly seemed like his life might turn around when an American family took pity on Pedro and adopted him. They brought him into their home, giving him clothes, a bed, food, and even putting him into education. For the first time in his life, Pedro experienced something resembling stability and normality. But the hope didn't last. According to some accounts, a teacher at his new school abused him. Others claim that he willingly ran away with that same teacher. But either way, by the time he was 12 years old, Pedro stole some money and abandoned his new life, returning to the only one he truly knew: the streets. By then, the violence that had torn the country apart was beginning to fade into history. The government was reorganizing, factories that had sat idle were reopening, and Colombia was trying to move forward. But Pedro had no trade, almost no education, and no real future. For 6 long years, he survived through begging and petty theft. And as he grew older, desperation pushed him toward bigger crimes. In his mid-teens, Pedro turned to stealing cars. Local chop shops were eager to pay for his work, and he quickly developed a reputation as a skilled thief. But by the age of 21, his dark path finally caught up with him. In 1969, he was arrested for stealing cars, and the court sentenced him to 7 years in prison. But prison did not rehabilitate him. Instead, it deepened his rage. Because behind bars, he was once again attacked and abused, this time by his fellow inmates. Colombian prisons in the late 1960s were a chaotic mess. Guards were few, corruption was rampant, and the inmates effectively ran the show. They weren't places of rehabilitation, they were breeding grounds for violence. Overcrowding meant there was no privacy. Smuggled weapons and drugs circulated freely. Fights broke out every day. Those who didn't learn to fight back didn't last long. New arrivals like Pedro were easy targets. He was young, thin, and carried the nervous energy and vulnerability of someone who'd spent most of his life as a victim. To the hardened criminals inside, he was easy prey. 3 older men began repeatedly assaulting and abusing him almost immediately after he arrived. But the Pedro they encountered was no longer the helpless child who'd been thrown onto the streets and forced to fend for himself. He was cold, hardened, and unwilling to be a victim anymore. So he bided his time, and after a couple of months, he struck back. Accounts differ on the precise details, but the outcome is clear. The 3 men who tormented him were found dead. The general consensus seems to be that their throats had been cut with a crude weapon fashioned from prison materials. But however it happened, Pedro murdered all 3 of them. The authorities were faced with a dilemma. In theory, he had murdered 3 fellow prisoners, but in practice, the killings were brushed aside as self-defense in a place where such violence was almost expected. So instead of facing new murder charges, a meager 2 additional years were quietly tacked onto his sentence. It was a small price to pay for the message it sent to his fellow inmates. Pedro was no longer a victim. Within the prison walls, he understandably gained a reputation. Other inmates, who once might have seen him as an easy target, now kept their distance. For the first time in his life, he'd discovered that murder could shift the balance of power. Later, Pedro himself would admit that this was the moment he realized something about himself, something terrifying. According to him, the act of killing brought him a sense of control, and even a twisted kind of satisfaction. By the time his extended sentence ended in 1978, Pedro had spent nearly a decade behind bars. He entered prison as a petty thief, but he walked out as a killer who'd convinced himself that killing was not only justified, but strangely rewarding. As Pedro put it himself, "When I killed those men in prison, I knew this was my destiny." That revelation would shape everything that followed. When he left prison, he didn't seek a new life, nor did he return to crime for survival. Instead, he set his sights on something larger, something much more sinister. After years of suffering violence, abuse, and humiliation, he was ready to inflict that same suffering on others. Instead of returning to Bogotá to rebuild his life, Pedro drifted south after his release and crossed the high Andes, making his way into rural Peru. And that was where his killing spree truly began. In later interviews, he would frame his murders as a twisted response to his own childhood, insisting that all of his hardship traced back to his mother. According to him, he wanted to steal the innocence of others because he believed his own had been taken from him. "I lost my innocence at 8 years old, so I decided to do the same to as many young girls as I could," he was quoted saying. And although he may have claimed killing became his destiny after murdering his 3 prison attackers, it was exclusively young children he chose to unleash his violence upon. He carefully selected his victims, targeting girls between the ages of 8 and 12, roughly the same age he'd been when his own childhood collapsed. He focused on street children who wouldn't be missed and indigenous children whose disappearances the police were more likely to ignore. He drifted from town to town, focusing on areas where strangers were common and records were practically non-existent. Markets became his scouting ground. He'd approach children in daylight that he felt had the right look of innocence and beauty. Then, he'd offer them something small, a mirror, a trinket, something cheap but tempting, or ask for directions, attempting to convince the child to leave with him. If they hesitated, he'd wait, sometimes shadowing a mother and daughter for days until the right moment presented itself. Then he'd lead the girl away from the crowds, to somewhere isolated where he'd already prepared a grave. Often he reused the same shallow pits, placing 3 or 4 bodies in them before burying them. He followed the same routine every time. He waited until sunrise, before he sexually assaulted his victim and placed his hands against their throats. When the sun rose, he claimed he would then strangle them to death. In his own words, "It was only good if I could see her eyes. I never killed anyone at night. It would have been wasted in the dark. I had to watch them by daylight. It took them between 5 and 15 minutes to die. Sometimes I had to kill them all over again. They never screamed because they didn't expect anything would happen. They were innocent." He would even sometimes slit their throats or wrists after he'd killed them, just to make sure they were truly dead. And he said that sometimes he would return later to continue assaulting their bodies. He later claimed that killing the girls was an act of mercy, insisting that by ending their lives young, he was sparing them from suffering. Disappearances mounted in Peru, particularly around indigenous communities in the Ayacucho region. Families reported their daughters missing, but many cases were filed as runaways or blamed on trafficking rings already known to operate in the region. Pedro later boasted that he'd killed well over 100 girls in Peru alone. And although that number can't be verified, the pattern of missing girls correlating with his time in the area is undeniable. Dozens upon dozens vanished. There were no sightings of them, no ransom notes ever received, and no bodies were ever found. Even though authorities didn't take the disappearances seriously, many of the tribes and villages in the region did, and they began whispering that a predator, a monster, was lurking in the mountains, hunting their children. A man who would soon come to be known as the Monster of the Andes. His mobility was his shield. When one community grew nervous, he just moved on, across a valley, over a ridge, and found a new market, where no one had heard the whispers and warnings yet. The villagers' suspicions were finally confirmed when Pedro was caught trying to abduct a 9-year-old girl in the Ayacucho region. Members of the local community pursued him through the rugged terrain until he was cornered. Believing him to be the one responsible for the disappearances of the hundreds of young indigenous girls across the country, they decided to dish out their own form of justice. The villagers stripped him, beat him, and buried him up to his neck in the earth. Then, they poured honey over his face and neck, intending to leave him for the ants to slowly consume him. For a moment, it seemed that Pedro's reign of terror was about to end right there, in the dirt of the Andes. But unfortunately, fate intervened. A missionary from the United States passing through the region pleaded with the villagers to spare him. She persuaded them to hand him over to the Peruvian authorities to face legal punishment for his crimes. The villagers reluctantly agreed, but when he was handed over to the police, they didn't actually have any evidence that he was a serial killer. All they had were the suspicions and the word of indigenous villagers, who were often dismissed and ignored at the time. And this instance was no different. The police didn't arrest Pedro. They didn't charge him with any crime. They didn't even investigate the accusations against him. Instead, they quietly deported him back to Colombia and wiped their hands of him. In effect, They released him to continue his relentless murder spree, an opportunity he immediately took full advantage of. The same methods followed him into Colombia, then to Ecuador. He drifted from market town to market town, watching, waiting, killing. At the peak of his crimes, he admitted to killing 2 or 3 children every single week. He even described holding twisted parties with their bodies, propping them up in shallow graves together and speaking to them as if they were still alive. Whether he truly did that is unclear. But given many of the victims that would later be found were clustered in graves of several bodies just as he claimed, it seems entirely plausible. It's believed that he killed around 100 girls in Colombia during this time, and around 100 more in Ecuador, bringing his victim total to well over 300. By late 1979 into early 1980, the numbers in central Ecuador began to climb in a way that ordinary people could feel. In and around Ambato, an Andean market city ringed by green slopes, parents started counting missing daughters not by ones and twos, but by dozens. Parents sent daughters on routine errands and they never returned. Missing child posters appeared on shop fronts. One mother paid for newspaper notices. Families organized their own searches along ravines and fence lines. Police continued to ignore the cases and write them off. Class and ethnicity undoubtedly played a role. Almost all of Pedro's victims were indigenous, homeless, or from poor households, and their cases didn't trigger the urgency that might have been seen elsewhere. By the turn of 1980, parents in Ambato escorted their daughters in pairs. Vendors kept children within arm's length. Rumors spread that something worse than trafficking was happening. That February, Ivanova Giacomo, the daughter of a wealthy and respected baker, was abducted and killed by Pedro. And because her family was prominent, authorities finally reacted. Posters went up, national papers took notice, and the country watched. Then in March of 1980, nature finally confirmed the city's worst fears to be true. After days of torrential rain around Ambato, swollen rivers ate at their banks, and slopes gave way. And as the waters receded, searchers slowly began to find the remains of 4 girls who had gone missing long before the storm. The revelation changed everything. What grieving families had been insisting for months, and what police had brushed aside, could no longer be dismissed. Someone had been hunting their daughters, burying them near the city and moving on. Only days later, on March 8th, the body of Ivanova was discovered in a farm outbuilding. She was found to have been assaulted and strangled in a way that perfectly mirrored the 4 bodies unearthed by the flood. And then the very next day, Pedro attempted to abduct another child at the market in Plaza Urbina, as described in the opening. But with everyone on such high alert, he was instantly spotted by her mother, chased down by vendors and held until police arrived to arrest him. After years of vanishing into the crowds, Pedro couldn't slip away this time. He was dragged from a market stall into a cell, and at last, the monster of the Andes was in custody. When police officers brought Pedro in, they were initially unsure what they were dealing with. He'd been ranting and raving when they arrested him, leading to suspicion that he might be mentally ill. But back at the station, he was silent. He refused to answer any questions they put against him. All they knew was that a number of bodies had been found over the last few days. Dozens of young girls had been reported missing for months in the area, and Pedro had been caught trying to abduct a similar-aged girl to the victims. So he became their prime suspect in the case. But unless he started talking, they had no evidence against him, and nothing tying him to any crimes, beyond the attempted abduction. After realizing their usual tactics weren't going to work, they came up with a risky plan to get Pedro to talk. While looking into his background, they discovered that he claimed to be a devout Catholic. So they wondered if Pedro might open up to a Catholic priest. After all, priests are bound by the sacramental seal, meaning anything told to them in confession cannot be shared with anybody, or they'd risk being excommunicated by the church. So they placed an undercover officer in his cell who was posing as a priest who'd been arrested. Because the officer's name was Captain Pastor Gonzalez, some reports have muddled this situation and claimed they sent a real priest in to talk to him. I assume they didn't just pick the captain because his name was Pastor, but you never know. Maybe they thought it would help sell the deception. So posing as a Catholic priest who'd been arrested for preying on children, they hoped Pedro might open up to him, both as a religious confidant and as a fellow predator who would understand his actions. After Captain Gonzalez had stayed in the cell with him for a number of days and slowly started to gain his trust, Pedro began talking to him, and what he revealed to the undercover officer shook him to his core. Believing his words could never be repeated by the fake priest, Pedro told him that he'd killed more than 300 girls across Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru. He described his methods in chilling detail, explaining how he lured the children in the daylight from marketplaces before assaulting them and strangling them with his bare hands at sunrise. He also told him about the shallow graves he buried the bodies in, and the bizarre and unspeakable things he'd do to the bodies when he'd return to tend to them, like a gardener looking after their prized flower bed. He even told him that he liked Ecuadorian girls the best because they were more trusting and gentle, and therefore easier to lure. Captain Gonzalez was so terrified by what Pedro was telling him that he spent every night in the cell sleeping with a towel subtly wrapped around his neck, terrified that at any moment Pedro would realize he wasn't a priest and strangle him in the dark. When he finally left the cell, he was visibly shaken. He told his colleagues that what Pedro had told him was beyond comprehension, and that he was not just another criminal. He was a monster, a predator on a scale they could never have imagined. The claims Pedro made were so overwhelming and insane that the investigators didn't initially believe them. But when confronted with the fact that his cellmate had been a police officer all along, Pedro didn't backtrack on his story. Instead, he doubled down and told them that if they doubted his claims, he would prove he was telling the truth. So a few days later, he was shackled in leg irons and escorted out of the police station to lead officers to his alleged gravesites. And it didn't take long for any doubts the investigators had to be erased. Over the next 6 weeks, he guided them to various gravesites in remote areas surrounding Ambato, as well as a number of other nearby provinces across the Andes. Officers followed him into the mountains, fields, and riverbeds, and one by one he pointed out the shallow graves he'd dug. And before long, they began uncovering the remains of young girls he'd murdered. Across the weeks, Pedro backtracked multiple times, claiming that he was innocent. To keep him cooperating, the officers escorting him feigned camaraderie with him and offered him luxuries like tobacco and beer, though this charade became increasingly difficult to maintain for them as body after body was discovered. The officers claimed he appeared as though he was enjoying the whole experience. At one point, he even lifted a victim's skull and tried to pose with it like it was a trophy, asking the police to photograph him with it, a request they obviously refused. He often had to be disguised in police uniform due to the intense reaction from the public. Villagers formed mobs demanding he be handed over to them. At various locations, crowds had to be held back by the police, intent on lynching him themselves. The anger, the pain, the frustration was evident everywhere they went. And the newspapers didn't help, covering every detail of what was going on in front-page stories about the monster of the Andes. All the while, Pedro seemed to treat the whole thing like it was some kind of sordid victory lap to finish off his career as the world's most prolific serial killer. By the time they'd finished, the Ecuadorian police had uncovered the remains of 53 young girls Pedro had murdered, many buried together in the same shallow graves. He also took them to around 30 other grave sites where no bodies were found, likely because scavenging animals or the recent floods which had already unearthed some of his victims had destroyed or removed the bodies already. The search wasn't stopped because Pedro had run out of graves to show them. It was because he stopped cooperating with them. As Major Victor Lascano, the governor of the Ambato prison, put it, "In the beginning he cooperated with us and took us each day to 3 or 4 hidden corpses, but then he tired, changed his mind, and stopped helping." He went on to say, "If someone confesses to 53 you find, and hundreds more you don't, you tend to believe what he says. I think his estimate of 300 is very low." And it's here that a question arises. Should his own confessed numbers be taken at face value? Serial killers often inflate their totals, seeking infamy and notoriety. Yet even stripped of exaggeration, the murders they had just confirmed already placed him among the most prolific serial killers in all of history. What made the confessions so haunting wasn't just the numbers. It was the way he delivered them. He never wept, never asked for forgiveness, never even hinted at regret. Forensic psychologists later noted the complete absence of empathy in his words was a hallmark of what they called cold-blooded psychopathy. Journalist Ron Leitner, who interviewed Pedro in the mid-1990s, which is where many of the quotes I've used come from, recorded statements that strongly reinforced this picture. In one of his most chilling quotes, Pedro said, "There is a divine moment when I have my hands around a girl's throat. I watch her eyes as she fades. Only those who kill understand." So the Ecuadorian authorities formally charged Pedro with 57 counts of murder for the 53 victims he'd just taken them to find, alongside the 4 who'd been discovered after the recent floods. For the families of the missing in Ecuador, these confessions brought a grim kind of clarity. Their daughters hadn't run away or fallen into the hands of traffickers. They'd been victims of a single man, operating in plain sight for years, while the authorities dismissed their disappearances. No other bodies were ever directly linked to him, though authorities in both Peru and Colombia were able to verify that his many murders claimed in both of their nations were corroborated by missing person reports. As a result, it seemed more than likely to both nations that his claims of killing around 100 young girls in each of them were true. Regardless, even the most conservative estimates of his total victim count left no doubt. The monster of the Andes had committed atrocities on a scale that defied comprehension. Between the bodies that had been discovered and Pedro's detailed confessions, he was officially linked to 110 murders in Ecuador alone, though the investigators knew his true toll stretched far beyond their country's borders. In July of 1981, Pedro pled guilty before a courtroom crowded with reporters and families of the many victims. And as a result, he was sentenced to the maximum penalty possible. However, at the time, Ecuadorian law didn't allow consecutive terms for murder and capped punishment at a fixed maximum. There was no death penalty. There were no life sentences. Whether a defendant killed one victim or 100, the ceiling was exactly the same. 16 years. Just 16 years. That's what the man found guilty of 110 murders of young girls was given. A man believed to have murdered more than 300 children. 16 years behind bars. The public was outraged. To families of the victims, the verdict felt like an insult. They wanted justice for their daughters, not to see the most prolific serial killer in history walk free in 16 years' time. But that was the most time he could be legally given, so that was the sentence he got. Pedro was initially held in Ambato before being moved to Quito's Garcia Moreno prison. Because relatives of his victims had placed a $25,000 bounty on his head, Pedro spent most of his sentence in solitary confinement. He rarely spoke to guards or other prisoners, living out his days in near-total isolation. He returned to his old ways of smoking bazuco and gave no indication that he felt any remorse or regret for what he'd done. Psychiatrists who assessed him described him as having a severe antisocial personality disorder and completely lacking empathy. According to their evaluations, he was a psychopath through and through. In 1992, he gave his only ever interview to Ron Leitner of the National Examiner. But before he would agree to answer any questions, he made a disturbing request. He told the warden that he hadn't touched a woman in nearly 12 years and would only do the interview if he could touch the hands of the warden's daughter. Reluctantly, the warden agreed. So with armed guards pointing their guns at him, the young woman stepped forward and extended her hands. Pedro then held her hands in his, running his fingers across her wrists. He later told Ron that at 26, the warden's daughter was far too old to actually interest him. Casually discussing his crimes in shocking levels of detail with Ron, he bragged that he was the man of the century and that he'd soon be a free man again. Strangely, he sometimes spoke about his victims as though he cared for them. He referred to them as my dolls and insisted he was sparing them from misery. He didn't even try and hide his intentions for after his release, openly declaring, "The moment of death is enthralling and exciting. Someday, when I am released, I will feel that moment again. I will be happy to kill again. It is my mission." But despite his statements, on August 31st, 1994, he was released from prison, not even serving his entire 16-year sentence, leaving 2 years early for good behavior. As you can imagine, the release triggered outrage across Ecuador. So in order to stop him from being hunted down and killed by mobs, he was immediately escorted to the Rumichaca border bridge and deported to his home nation of Colombia. Interestingly, Colombian authorities had long expressed their own desire to prosecute him for the 100+ murders he allegedly committed there. And unlike Ecuador, if he was found guilty in Colombia, he would almost certainly be imprisoned till the day that he died. So after taking him into custody, Colombian prosecutors reopened their files and looked for any murder or disappearance that matched his known pattern, quickly linking him to the deaths of several girls in Tolima during the late 1970s. But the case then took another bizarre turn. In 1995, rather than facing trial, Pedro was declared legally insane by a Colombian court and transferred to a psychiatric hospital in Bogotá. Doctors argued that his mental condition made him not fully responsible for his actions. and to grieving families, it felt like yet another betrayal. For 3 years, Pedro remained in that hospital. Then, in 1998, a second evaluation reversed the earlier ruling. Doctors now declared him sane, and with that, he was released back into the public. The conditions of his freedom were almost laughable. Pedro was asked to pay the equivalent of about $50 in bail, a trivial sum considering the scale of his crimes. He was also ordered to check in with the authorities once a month. That was the safeguard meant to protect the public from a man who had confessed to killing more than 300 children. Pedro instantly posted his bond, and at 50 years old he was released back into the world for a second time. He never kept his appointments, never reported to the police, and never submitted himself to monitoring of any kind. By the time officials even realized he was gone, Pedro had slipped back into the shadows and vanished. After hearing about his release in Colombia, Major Victor Lascano, governor of Ambato prison where Pedro spent most of his sentence, gave a stark warning. God save the children. He is unreformed and totally remorseless. This whole nightmare may start again. Many felt the same way. Pedro never showed any signs he'd changed, or even that he regretted a single one of his murders. To the contrary, he openly boasted that he would continue killing once he was released. When he left the hospital, Pedro immediately went to visit his mother, a woman he hadn't seen in decades. When she found him at her door, she assumed he had come to kill her. But instead, he demanded that she kneel so he could bless her. When she refused, insisting that it was a mother's role to bless her child, he begrudgingly dropped to one knee himself. Their brief reunion ended with cruelty. Pedro stripped her home of her only possessions, her bed and her armchair, and dragged them outside, threatening to burn them unless someone bought them. So a neighbor handed over a small amount of cash to him. Pedro pocketed the money and walked away. The final confirmed sighting of Pedro after his release occurred on September 22, 1999, when he appeared at a Bogotá government office to renew his national ID card, which shockingly, he was somehow able to do without triggering any kind of alert. The exchange was logged in official records, and then Pedro was never seen again. For the families of his victims, the thought of him walking free was unbearable. Carlina Ramon Poveda, the mother who had raised the alarm when Pedro tried to abduct her daughter in Ambato, spoke for many when she said, "He won't live long. It will be a kindness to the world for someone to murder this fiend. The monster of the Andes won't last long on the outside. Maybe that is why we haven't heard of more missing girls. Perhaps someone, even the police in Colombia or Ecuador, have already killed him. If they have, I hope they made him suffer." Rumors of sightings spread across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Citizens phoned radio stations and reported to the police whenever someone even resembling him appeared in their towns. Officers in border regions and throughout the Andes even carried photos of him in their wallets to help them identify him in case they ever crossed paths with him. Ecuador's Minister of Prisons, Pablo Figuero, was questioned about why such a monster had been released. He admitted bluntly, "Yes, it does sound strange, but that is our law." He explained that Ecuador's prohibition on executions and long sentences dated back more than a century, originally meant to prevent the brutal killings of deposed presidents during revolutions. The law seemed humane, he said. But that humane law meant that one of history's most prolific serial killers had walked free. By 2002, fears of fresh killings by Pedro reignited when Colombian authorities asked Interpol to issue an international warrant for his arrest. 2 new child murders in Tolima bore disturbing similarities to his old methods. So whispers spread through the public and the press. Had the monster of the Andes started killing again? But the warrant yielded nothing. No sightings, no arrests, no confirmation of his whereabouts. And 3 years later, the Interpol notice was quietly deactivated. What followed was a vacuum, filled with speculation. Some claimed Pedro had been spotted wandering through small towns in central Colombia, living as a beggar. Others insisted he had been quietly executed, either by vigilantes seeking revenge or by police who preferred to eliminate him rather than face the shame of another failed prosecution. A persistent rumor held that he was still alive and living in Tolima, the region where he was born. Hiding in plain sight, his identity known only to locals too afraid to speak. The uncertainty only deepened in 2012 when another case shocked Colombia. The murder of a 12-year-old girl in Tunja. Her body was found strangled, and though police never tied Pedro directly to the crime, rumors spread quickly. For many, the brutality of her death felt too familiar. It was exactly the kind of killing the monster of the Andes had once confessed to committing hundreds of times. Officially, there was no evidence, but unofficially the possibility kept his name alive. Even his mother insisted he was still alive, telling reporters, "I know he hasn't died." Other relatives of mine appeared to me in the form of a presence after they died, but he didn't. I know he's still out there somewhere. Criminologists have long argued that Pedro would never have stopped killing if he was still alive. Serial offenders of his kind, those driven by compulsion rather than opportunity, almost never do. As one investigator bluntly put it, the only way he stopped is if he was stopped by death. For a while, Guinness World Records listed Pedro as the most prolific serial killer of all time, attributing over 300 victims to him. But in 2006, they removed the category from their books after drawing criticism that it turned murder into a competition. Still, the record books didn't need to name him. His legacy was already cemented. Pedro had become a symbol of two things: the horrifying depths of human cruelty and the catastrophic failures of justice systems unable or unwilling to protect the most vulnerable. But perhaps the most chilling part of Pedro's story is that it does not have an ending. Nobody knows what happened to him after his release. The list of people who wanted Pedro dead was probably in the thousands. Villagers who'd spent years living in fear of the monster of the Andes. Families, relatives, and loved ones of the many, many victims. Members of the police who felt the justice system had failed them. Hell, anyone who felt like the murderer of more than 300 children didn't deserve to live, let alone have his freedom. The tragedy of Pedro's story is not only in the staggering number of children he murdered, but in the systemic failures that allowed him to disappear. Ecuador's weak sentencing laws, Colombia's psychiatric loopholes, and the repeated dismissal of indigenous and poor victims all played a part. 3 countries failed their most vulnerable, and because of those failures, the monster of the Andes was able to simply slip into the shadows, both before his arrest and after it. Whether he was quietly killed in revenge, died in obscurity, or continued murdering in anonymity, nobody truly knows. The only thing we can say for certain is that Pedro Lopez confessed to hundreds of killings, led police to dozens of graves, and then walked free. If he is still alive, Pedro would be in his 70s now. But it seems hard to believe that a killer with such an intense bloodlust, who almost certainly would have carried on killing, could have continued living unnoticed over the decades since he vanished. If he was still alive, if he'd even survived more than a couple years after his release, it seems hard to imagine there wouldn't be an endless string of missing girls and dead bodies he was responsible for. But then again, part of the reason Pedro's crimes were able to be dismissed for so long was because the places he hunted in were already drowning in violence and death, thanks to civil wars, traffickers, cartels, and warlords. In such chaos, a monster like Pedro could vanish into the noise, his murders hidden among countless others that would never be solved, and would barely even be acknowledged by the authorities. So if Pedro survived and if he continued killing, then the nightmare possibility is this: his true body count could stretch into the thousands. Ultimately, whether he's dead or alive, the shadow, the ghost of Pedro, still haunts the Andes. If he is gone, the mountains of the Andes kept the secret of his death. And if he's not, those same mountains are still keeping the secret of his victims. And with that, our deep dive into the case of the monster of the Andes comes to a close. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you found this video interesting, please like and subscribe and do all that sort of stuff that tells the algorithm gods it's worth pushing the video out and showing it to others. I would say to hype the video too, but given I have no idea what that means, I don't really see the point. Anyway, as I said up front, Pedro's case has been requested a lot of times in the comments section, so I hope I was able to tell it in a way you all found interesting. It's kind of an odd one in a research sense. It's pretty well known, yet the facts and details are really hard to verify. There's different information all over the place, and there really isn't much in the way of contemporary sources or records available. I'm surprised there isn't more out there about it, to be honest. From what I can see, there is only one serial killer with more officially confirmed victims than Pedro in all of history, and he just so happens to also be Colombian. His name is Luis Garavito, and I'm actually not familiar with his story at all. So if you'd like me to start researching it for a video, then let me know down below. If you want to support my channel further, There's a membership option here on YouTube and a Patreon linked down in the description as well. So until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss.